Group is currently in Canada, and today he's been visiting the site of a former Indigenous residential school. Well, during his visit, the 85-year-old pontiff delivered a long-awaited apology. That's for the role of the Catholic Church in Canada's policy of forcibly assimilating Native peoples into Christian society. Well, the Canadian government admits that physical and sexual abuse were rampant in these government-funded schools, which were operational from the 19th century through to the 1970s. Well, some 150,000 children were forced to attend these schools, where thousands of them died. Well, for more, we can speak now to Jackson Pind, who is Assistant Professor of Indigenous Methodologies at Trent University. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. The Pope has apologised for what the Catholic Church's role was, and he called this policy devastating. What does this apology actually change, do you think?
Sadly, it does not change that much. We've been waiting for this apology for about 7 years now from the calls to action, which was number 58, that asked the Pope to come to Canadian soil and to apologize for the crimes that happened in residential schools. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, the Pope actually did not acknowledge the sexual abuse that happened in the residential schools. He just said physical and verbal abuse, and also did not talk about the psychological abuse that was also a key component of these schools. So while it is nice to finally have an apology, it has taken over decades actually to get this apology in the first place. The Anglican Church of Canada and the United Church of Canada actually apologized in 1993 and 1987, respectively.
Just tell us a bit more about the background, because in the last year or so, there's been the discoveries of hundreds of possible burial sites at former schools. I mean, what do we know about what actually happened in these schools?
These schools were to be frank, as worst schools you could ever imagine possible. They existed for over 150 years for generations of Indigenous students. And as I just spoke about, the physical, mental, sexual abuse was a key component, as well as removing Indigenous languages and cultures. At one school in Northern Ontario that was run by the Catholic Church, St. Anne's Residential School, they still have not returned the documents from this school. There's actually allegations and tons of witnesses that say an electric chair was used on children to forbid them from using their languages in these institutions. So basically, the most horrific institutions you could ever imagine were really these ones run by the Catholic Church in Canada.
And it sounds like there was an attempt there to cover up.
Yes, for sure. The documents have never been returned by the Catholic Church of Canada. That's one of the demands as well by survivors. As well, we've only been talking about only 44 of the residential schools, and his apology only acknowledged those 44. But in reality, the Catholic school, in partnership with the Canadian government, actually operated 327 Indian day schools as well, which is basically the same type of system run by the Catholic Church. The only difference was that children could go home at night, but the same types of abuses actually occurred. And just actually in 2019, $1.9 billion was paid by the Canadian government to survivors out of that settlement fund. So there's still a whole host of other schools and institutions that the church was a part of that really impacted Indigenous peoples that hasn't really been addressed whatsoever yet.
I mean, these discoveries and these revelations the last couple of years have caused shock and outrage around the world, and clearly there in Canada as well. Is this something you think people in school are starting to learn about? Is this a subject people are now openly talking about it? Is it on the syllabus of history classes?
That's unfortunately a really difficult question to answer right now. The Ontario government and the Alberta government have both changed their curriculums in this country to not actually address fully the whole story of residential schools. There were supposed to be changes as a result of the TRC calls to action again. Number 63 actually was to ask for all education to include this history, but has been slow adopting across the country, unfortunately. And we really need this education out there in order for this not to happen again.
Yeah, because, I mean, clearly there have been generations of trauma and abuse. I mean, when you talk to people in Canada, who do people blame? Do they blame the church? Do they blame the government? Do they blame the monarchy even?
I think, yeah, those three were all part of this system, and they all have their hands to blame for what happened in this school. But we can really see the impacts on Indigenous people today, actually. About 40 to 50%, somewhere in that number, depending in the province, children grow up in poverty as a direct result of this system. If your parents could not go to university or post-secondary generationally, right, you didn't have the same opportunities as settler Canadians at this time, you're way farther behind in income level and income attainment, and also educational attainment for the rest of your life. youth. And those are huge discrepancies felt throughout our high school graduation rates, our post-secondary rates of Indigenous people, and further up into government and other high positions.
Okay, well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Professor Jackson Pinn, thank you very much indeed.
Miigwech.